Welcome to RPG Reanimators, a podcast for GMs where we dissect horror scenarios and offer our experiences and advice to reanimate it at the table. I'm Holly.
I'm Lex.
I'm Alex.
And I'm Nathan.
So let's see what's on the slab. The case report for this session is Music from a Darkened Room, which is a scenario written by Dennis Detweiler for Delta Green and is included in the collection A Night at the Opera. In this scenario, the agents investigate the death of a veteran Delta Green agent in a house with a strange history of misery. As with any dissection, we'll be discussing all the gross innards of the scenario, so from this point on, there will be spoilers. So if you're interested in playing this scenario, please stop here and share this episode with your GM so they can listen and consider running this for your group. We'll also include links for where you can purchase a copy of this scenario for yourself and in the show notes of this episode. Now with that out of the way, let's begin our dissection. So let's get into the general setup of Music from a Darkened Room. What's the setup? How do the player characters get involved?
Well, like a lot of good Delta Green scenarios, it starts out with a dead Delta Green agent. In this case, FBI Special Agent Arthur Donnelly, who's found dead in a home he doesn't own. It's just a house out on Spooner Street. Turns out the group realizes he reported this house as a vector years ago, but no one really did anything with it. So now you have to clean up that mess and figure out what the heck is going on with this house.
And is there a certain time period this takes place in? Is it pretty flexible?
As far as I can tell, it's pretty flexible. I wouldn't feel too bad about setting this current day, but if you wanted to play like a cowboy game, you can adjust it to that very easily. And of course, behind the scenes, house is haunted, man. Like, this is a classic Scooby-Doo gang goes into the haunted house and probably dies or goes crazy.
Just with a lot more suicide than usual.
Yeah. Zoink scoop. Fred took the easy way out.
Is there a catalyst for the agents investigating the home? Like, does something happen, or are they just the kind of typical Delta Green? You get a memo, go look into this.
So, as written, the agents are actually the second team to go through this house.
Okay.
The whole situation with Arthur Donnelly being found dead was apparently addressed by a previous Delta Green cell or group of agents who came in to quiet everything down. They gave an official statement that he was a really sick individual and basically sweep things under the rug so no one looked any deeper. Now this group is being brought in to dig deeper and find out why Donnelly would have done this, because it's not like him to fuck up in a very public manner like this.
I want to talk about what's actually happening.
Okay.
Adele Divatello, who is a witch who worships the Dark Man, an avatar of Nyarlathotep, has consecrated the site, which is 1206 Spooner Ave, as a location for her eldritch deity. And basically, she has taken advantage of a previous homeowner. I believe her name was Elizabeth Wheeler. No,
Isabel Wheeler.
Isabel Wheeler. And part of her soul was trapped in the house, and all the worst aspects of her were trapped in the house, and therefore she would try and lure other people and other homeowners in here after she passed on to feed this consecrated site. And that's what's causing all this weird stuff.
Brutal. So getting into the other locations described in the text, aside from the house, obviously the house sounds like it's kind of the key feature, but is there anywhere else the agents are likely to go?
Yeah, so other locations identified in the text are the county seat, where they can find public data, or there's the Meadowbrook Sparrow, which is the newspaper office. They can go to the police station to find records of crimes that have happened in the area. There's also Fulton College, which is mentioned, as well as the Meadowbrook Storet, which is the location of the green box and a potential threat.
And does the scenario itself give a lot of detail to these maps, pictures, anything like that? What can we expect from reading the scenario?
The only map that's really provided is that of the house. And I think that's sufficient enough, since that's the meat and potatoes of the scenario.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, how about the NPCs that your agents are likely to encounter?
Well, beyond the store it individual who's a nuisance, yeah, most of the other characters are actually going to be vaguely helpful or at least maybe a potential antagonist, but they don't start out that way. You've got Elizabeth Tucker, who is an antiques dealer who lives in Meadowbrook. That's going to be important because some of the antiques from the house have been shipped out, and they, of course, have been
Ooh.
tainted by evil.
Ah,
And
that's fun.
yes, terrible things happen. There is Emil Yarrow, is a parapsychologist, an associate professor of abnormal psychology at Fulton College, a couple towns over. There's a lot of people that have obsessions or mental damage from just being in this house. So he might be a useful tool if your agents aren't
Mm.
particularly gifted.
Well, he's intended to be viewed as a useful tool, but actually, something I really love about the scenario is Emil Yarrow is a trap. All of his options and suggestions are wrong. He will recommend players spend time at the house at night to try and commune with residual energy and things in there. And it may take a bit for your players to follow the quote unquote expert before they realize that he's kind of bluffing his way through most of it.
Now, to be
Yeah.
fair, I said useful, but not to the players. That's a really helpful GM tool if your players are going, I don't know how we want to approach this house. Having someone give just awful advice is really funny. And the last individual is Michael Buffington, which is a great last name. He's the police chief. He is very generic. He's just going by the rules, no funny business.
If he were a spice, he'd be flour.
Exactly. Is honestly, all three of these are good backup characters if you
Oh,
need
nice.
somebody to pop in.
Mhm,
Lex made a face, he completely disagrees, but I could see you modifying them a little bit if you have a player that dies early,
mhm.
and maybe they can give a little bit more spice to Michael. But as it is, he's more of a threat if your agents are making waves in the neighborhood. If they're drawing a lot of attention, you might see the police start to show up.
And those are the only three NPCs that are actually named in the back of the book. There's a
Mhm.
few other folks. Alex alluded to Brian Miglia, who is the kind of scummy clerk at the Meadowbrook store it, who is going to try to extort a little bit of money out of the agents in order to get access to the green box because Donnelly's owed them some back pay. But also something that is a bit frustrating. As we mentioned, there's a lot of other locations in the town, county seat, the newspaper office, Fulton College, and other places. Also, the Meadowbrook Inn that they're likely going to be staying at in the town. There are a lot of other NPCs in this town that are given no description, are completely on the GM to invent. So I do recommend spending some time really thinking about these before you just jump in. Otherwise, you're going to do what I did and scramble your first time running it.
And don't forget the most important NPC of them all, which is the house, because I would very much argue that it is a character in its own right.
Oh, absolutely.
The third character, 1206 Spooner Street.
You were reading my mind, Nathan.
And of course, there's also some living people that left the house as well. We don't need to go into detail of all of them because there's a large history of who lived in the house, who died in the
Mhm.
house, who made it out.
Who lives next door, right?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. There's quite a bit of that, but in terms of probably, I would say, major people to draw from, to your point, Lex, they are sprinkled throughout and you don't see them at the back fully statted out.
Right. They might reach out to those other people once, and
Yeah.
that's it. They get a clue and probably never anything else.
Right.
And that's from your experience in the games you run, Lex?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's in typical Delta Green fashion. The previous victims of the house are kind of difficult to reach out to. I mean, if you're just going to fire someone up on Facebook and say, "Hey, I'm checking out this house your wife died in. Can you chat? You
Oh
up?"
my God.
Like, it's not going to work out. So it can be difficult to get in touch with them. And even if they do, they're going to get another piece of the house's sordid history and move on. There's not really any reason for them to get involved aside from Anton's sister, but that's a stretch. I'll give it that.
Well, you can make them a reoccurring character if you like romance them, right?
Sure. I
Unlock
won't
the
say
side
no.
quest. I also had a child die at a young age.
Oh my God.
Yeesh. So, if we're talking about the meat and potatoes of the scenario, the house, these NPCs. What is posing a threat to the agents?
I think first and foremost, the green box, because that's the one that's a ticking time bomb. Because
How so?
Brian Miglia, he's interested in seeing everyone going into this one storage unit and coming out, and he's kind of corrupt where he wants to like claim everything in it for himself because he thinks it's valuable and illegal. And the only thing he's ever gonna find in there, if he does get in there, is a dead child, which is the body of Anton Turi, one of the house's victims who drowned in a toilet. It's not really explained who dug up the body, but it's implied to be Donnelly.
Yes.
So if there is that body found, it's going to be a shit show, which isn't actually described in much detail as a consequence in the text.
Does the text kind of give you a feel for that clock? Like by day 3 or something, Miglia will find the body, or is it a little bit ambiguous?
Not necessarily. It's just that Donnelly hasn't paid the rent for the box in several months because he's been dead. And if a certain amount of time expires, then Brian legally is able to open up the box. He thinks that there may be drugs or some kind of valuables inside, and so he's going to do it if the agents don't check it out. And even if they do, he's nosy enough to maybe break some laws and sneak in, if you wanted an additional threat to worry about.
Yeah, I kind of liked that, as if the players aren't circumspect about it or they don't flash their badge, which a lot of the time players don't want to be seen as law enforcement, that's when he goes, well, they're not law enforcement. Let me just break in at night when they leave it alone and see what I can get. So that can be kind of a counterintuitive case for them, where maybe showing off a little bit of the police or government would be helpful for them.
I mean, all the text says is the police become involved and it becomes a nightmare for the FBI.
That was going to be my question, if it's kind of detailed what the consequences are of Miglia finding the body, but...
No, not really. It's a very spurious threat. And honestly, I think as a GM, you're going to be too busy running the house to really worry about bringing in anything else because, oh, she is very fun.
Well, tell me about the house, Lex.
So, as Alex mentioned, the house is essentially all of Isabel Wheeler's pain and illness and loneliness and everything negative, all that bitter old white lady hate, has been pocketed behind the mirrors within 1206 Spooner Avenue for years. And after she died, that energy persisted. And in all of this pain and angst, it's also lonely and wants to share this pain with others and bring others in. So this is where the people that continue coming into the house are infatuated with it, and they want to help restore it. And also, the house is feeding on them. The house drains people's misery. In mechanical terms, their sand loss, and feeds on it because that sates this shadow Isabel Wheeler figure. If someone dies within the house and have a very low POW score, they get sucked behind the mirrors as well to join Wheeler, and can be another ghost in your arsenal. So because of this, the house has a vested interest in bringing people in. At first, it'll want to entice the agents to spend more time looking around. It's a little spooky, but maybe there's a little something more right around that corner. And then it'll usually bring up a bang, in my experience, because it wants that sand loss. Once it accumulates a little bit, it can then attempt to influence the agents via obsession or outright possession, which I don't recommend bringing up until very late in the game. At least half of the scenario is full of manifestations that you can use for the house. It's by far one of my favorite things about it. Whatever room they're in, you have a list of things that you can go through to bring up something weird that happens if you want. It separates them by willpower. I don't ever really worry about it. Just think of it like an extremity meter. How hard do you want to hit?
Yeah, so you kind of start out low on those, no matter what the willpower is, and then escalate, kind of.
Actually, just from reading the text, mechanically, it seems like the less willpower an agent has, the worse the scare / weirder it is. And it's based off of the current willpower.
For that, I would say yes and no, as sometimes in places like the master bedroom, higher willpower folks are going to suffer more. They're going to be very disoriented and nauseous. And it's just basically, think of it as kind of psychic energies intermingling. that if someone has a lot of willpower about them, there's something weird about the house that's disruptive.
See, I'm not so sure about that. I don't know what Debt Willer was thinking because there's cases where there's lower willpower and you get more information.
Well, and that's what I was going to say is that the
Yeah.
lower willpower someone has, the more easy they are to take advantage of. So essentially, it's easier prey. And so the house can give more of a pronounced shock to them because it's
Okay.
basically influencing what they see and hear. A lot of it is mental, some of it is physical. That's going to be up to the GM how much you want to blend between the two. They can see some of the residents walking around inside. You can hear some of them gasping for breath in their final moments if they're in the bonus room above the attic. And with all of that, it's not limited to just the senses. The house can also reach out to them. Any reflective surface is a potential vessel for Isabel Wheeler to take effect. So I really recommend when agents are in the house, have them get a phone call. If they bring their phone out, Isabel can now reach out to them through that phone, imitating other agents, the people within the house, or other people that have been through. The coroner spent a lot of time in the house, so maybe he gives them a call about some new lead. This was a really unexpected aspect that surprised my players a lot, because whenever they got calls, they came to the house and realized they were not safe if they were outside of its walls. It could still touch them.
I like that. I'm always a fan of modern technology being used against players.
Yeah, and this one does it really well, in my opinion. I wish that there was a little more guidance because this was some of my players' favorite aspects of the scenario, and it's something that's kind of hard to bring up unless you plan for it ahead of time. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say, when the house gets tired of you, it just kills you. I tend to play the house very coy, and it's just a cat playing with a bunch of mice. And when it gets bored, or if the mice start tearing up floorboards in the house, yeah, the claws are coming down.
So you did mention that, the people that die in the house, like there's an effect, they're kind of drawn into the house itself. Is there a good write-up on that if you should have agents die in the house, of like how to handle that?
Yes, there is actually.
Good.
Yeah. Basically, if an agent dies within the house, they need to do a very important POW contest. And if the house wins, they are trapped behind the mirrors within. They need to have it's below a certain value and then lose that POW contest.
11 willpower.
There you go.
Are the characters still kind of playable at that point, or is it
No.
really just okay, so the GM controls them at that point? Okay.
Yes, at that point, because something that's very interesting with the ghosts, air quotes, within the house, they are kind of the people, but can be controlled by Isabel Wheeler at any moment. So this is where you can have some very fun times of Anton, who was a little boy. He's running around the house still trying to play. He's lonely. He's cold. He just wants to hug some of the agents. Isabel can take control of him at any time. And suddenly this very sympathetic character is now leading them right into a trap. And the agents don't have a solid idea about it until it happens.
And one thing not to lose sight of with this too is there's a lot of these manifestations. There's a lot of ghosts. And you might have agents that go, well, it's scary, but it's not physical, right? It's all an illusion, Michael. Well, that's when you realize that the knives that are flying around are real, or in a playthrough I saw, which I really liked, it's all these agents walking around with guns that just started going off in the house because it's not that hard to pull a trigger or turn off a safety as a ghost. So they learned very quickly to leave that outside the door.
Oh, imagine just that handgun going off in the holster. That would be
I
really
would-
awful.
If you've got agents that end up pointing guns at each other, I would not hesitate for a second to pull the trigger as the house, even if the agent didn't mean to, because that would be really funny.
There are some really fun things that you can do with that are mentioned in the text. Is there's a couple of like jump scares in the scenario where they hear something scratching around in the chimney, and if they happen to look under, it's a pigeon that flutters out, scares the bejesus out of them. But mentions if an agent has a gun out, they need to roll, I think it's sand, to not accidentally pull the trigger. There's another manifestation that a shotgun blast goes off in the room with the agents. I would also call for another roll, but like not have your gun go off either.
Yep.
I'd like to talk more about the obsession and possession, because I think it just got mentioned a little bit in passing, but what is that going to look like for player characters and the actions that they're going to be taking?
So obsession is the house's main way of getting new residents to come in. This is what happened as you read through Donnelly's notes. This is what happened to Donnelly in the past. This house has been a ghost story around him, and until he really had experience with Delta Green with true unnatural vectors, he didn't think much of it. Until coming back home and seeing that other people had been unaliving themselves within its walls. So in looking, he went to an open house and suddenly couldn't get it out of his mind and was going to spend his own money to buy it until he got called off on something else. And then it describes he shook it like a bad cold. That with that distance and that separation, that obsession can wane. The scenario gives some instructions for how this can happen. Anyone that has 11 or fewer willpower, the house can attempt a POW roll against them. It has to spend that much POW to attempt the roll. So that's where it has a vested interest in constantly draining more sand from people. If they fail, they are obsessed with the house. And I'll quote, "Visitors infatuated with the house seem normal, but will do anything in their power to defend the house from harm, including cold-blooded murder. The obsessed believe they are acting of their own free will." So in this case, I have a handout that I'll give to agents that they can use as a roleplay hook. And I may send them some private messages. Hey, you might want to be doing this. But again, it's not really under their volitional control. Possession is just this on steroids. The house is now controlling their strings, and it can either let them watch what it's doing with their bodies, or they just black out, and you have manual control over them for a few seconds or minutes. Just enough time to shoot another agent in the back.
Brutal. So be ready for a little PvP in this one, sounds like.
Absolutely. With these two mechanics, I would fully anticipate at least some PvP happening at the table. There's a bit of a barrier between it because you can say, sorry, it wasn't me, it was the house. I was being controlled. Right. And so that can smooth it down a little bit. But if your group doesn't do very well with it, I might be a bit hesitant with this scenario.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and you might also be able to take away some of the possession aspects if you wanted to go that way and rely on just the obsession. But also, one of the things that we'll mention possibly later is the house can rebuild itself. It doesn't necessarily like to. That takes, more time. It needs to get people involved. But if I was having trouble with PvP, players that didn't want that, and they became obsessed with it, I'd say, no, at the moment, the house says, go ahead, do whatever you need to do. I don't care. And then later during some of that home scenes, they might come back and do that. Works better for a long-term game, but that might be an option too if your players don't want to, as we said, shotgun somebody in the back of the head on the lawn.
And actually, speaking of a long-term game, something that I can say, this scenario tends to run pretty long. A lot of other Delta Green investigations I can tend to knock out in 3 to 4 sessions or so. I tried to run this one within 4 sessions, but both times I've ran it, it has taken 8 or more. There's a lot of room for players to go around Meadowbrook. It's a reason I really recommend fleshing out the town more, because this is a nice slow burn.
So on the topic of obsession, once they're obsessed, like rules is written, that's it, right? They're just an accomplice of the house for the rest of the scenario.
It's more up to the GM whenever that would want to fade away. It's as it shows with Donnelly, like it can with time or with distraction. So if they do spend a lot of time away from the house, then I will tend to offer another contested POW roll. And it's just essentially, if they pass a POW test, I may do a secret GM roll or I may not, depends on if I'm bored. You can choose when you want to let that obsession fade away. But generally, it's a nice kind of a sleeper agent surprise because it's not immediately obvious for the other players.
More on that later.
So if we're talking about the timeline of the scenario, what key events stand out?
I mean, the call about Donnelly that gets them in is probably the most important thing, right? That kind of brings them in, gets them an idea. But after that, this is very sandboxy. I know, Lex, you've talked about in the past where they don't go into the house for a few sessions.
Yeah. It's people have good reason to be wary from the outset. And so because of that, the first few sessions will tend to be research about it. As everyone is familiar with the spooky haunted house. And so they're like, no, I'm not going into the spooky house. I want to learn how to deal with it first. And so it's already set up as an interesting antagonist from the get-go. I expected my second group to just blow right in and try to burn the house up. They were extremely wary, which was really fun for me as the house constantly trying to tempt them back in.
Is this Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green?
Yeah.
Investigating before you go in?
Honestly, that's an odd thing about the scenario. This is my favorite Delta Green scenario, but it could 100% be Call of Cthulhu straight up. They can just be people who have a reason to look into this crazy laundry list of murders into the house. Go. It's just a really nice setup, no matter how you slice it.
Yeah, I feel like I would have players, because I know my players, they would just go into the house. So I feel like this is very largely player dependent.
Potentially, yeah. I have been surprised that my players have not just gone straight into the house, but they have all, at least it knowing that Arthur Donnelly killed himself inside here. He should not have done that. He killed himself in the same way as Yamila Isari, the previous tenant, the exact same way. So they have a reason to think, okay, I am not going to go in there. Their handler warns them that the house can maybe exert some kind of mental influence. So they're very wary of just going in from the outset. I'd be curious to run it with a more pulpy group, though, because rules as written, it's very funny if players try to burn down the house. Because in the same way that the house can trigger obsession or possession, there's a lot of elderly neighbors that are adjacent to the house in the immediate vicinity. And if someone tries to burn it down, you are suddenly going to have 90-plus-year-old people breaking their hips, sprinting out of the house with garden hoses, putting the fire out, because it is like SOS possessing them to do so, to save itself. And that's one of the reasons that none of the fires have ever stuck with it.
Interesting. So maybe the delta is whether or not your group has watched The Grudge recently.
Beyond that, key events might be the green box discovery. That usually is kind of a big bang where they have to figure out, how do I get in here without getting in trouble? And then they find the coffin. And that's a good point where they go, oh, Donnelly was way further than we thought, at least when I've watched these things. Because there's a lot of this thought of like, well, Donnelly went there and killed himself. It's not that bad. And then you get what this 9-year-old, I mean, the corpse is way older, so it's all decayed and gross. The coffin's got a little plaque on it, but that to the like them going, oh, he just dug up a kid. Yeah, that's he was not well.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of the finale for a lot of these too is kind of the capstone that's the same for a lot of these, right? Is you'd have two ways of ending this. One is they think, well, three. They think they did it. They go away and you go, you fools, the house survives. And they get a cool epilogue where they realize they've accomplished nothing.
That wouldn't be an ending for me if I were to reanimate it.
Yeah, I'd probably then say, okay, a year later, this comes up. What are your agents
You're
doing?
back in it.
Yeah, which is fun because I don't see that a lot in other
It's a
scenarios.
fake out ending.
Yeah. Another way is to summon our good buddy, Nyarlathotep, and I believe sacrifice somebody to him.
Spicy.
And then, then say, get on out of here. Go on, scoot.
Go on, get.
Yep. And he does, shockingly.
A good moral dilemma.
And a third way, and this is one I'm very interested in, they somehow go, hey, you know what we should have, guys? An elder sign. And all the agents go, hell yeah, what an idea. We all know what that is and how to make one. And then they bring it in and the house is like, ew, gross, I hate this. And that, I think they have to smash mirrors.
Yeah, if they use an elder sign to smash the mirrors, that's it. Yay.
So the scenario assumes that your players would organically decide to do that without any outside.
It literally, at the end of the scenario, it is describing ways to overcome the house. Okay. And so you remove the consecration through the ritual or elder sign. This solution is suggested nowhere in the house or its history, but if the agents are familiar with the elder sign, it is a potent weapon against the forces that haunt
the metagame gambit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or in my case, a lifeline for a group of agents who have stalled out hard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Maybe we can talk about how we could organically introduce in the scenario when we get into the reanimation, because, I think there might be room for that.
Love it.
Well, what do we think is the beating heart of the scenario? The vibes, the theme, what we're wanting to see when we're running it?
This is a classic haunted house mystery. I mean, the house is the main spot. It should be the main spot. People go in, they get haunted, everybody's happy.
Yes, and I think that it is a classic haunted house mystery that still manages to subvert player expectations. My previous group that I ran through this were completely floored whenever they realized that the house could still call them, and that they were saying afterwards that everything truly felt like it was the house that was haunting them, that was affecting them. It didn't feel like a ghost or an entity within the house, but the ghosts felt like they were also there, a part of it, but there was no separation between this building that somehow was acting around them. I took a lot of inspiration from Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey for this, which I also recommend. There's a lot of organic house metaphors, like my favorite sentence, the walls were warm as skin.
Ew. I hate that.
Love it.
Okay, well, let's talk about the strengths and limitations of the scenario as it's written.
I'll start. This is a hell of a sandbox. There's a lot of detail here. There's a lot of areas your players can go in. They can go look at the furniture. They can go look at the history. They can camp out in the place at night. And they all have pretty good details. And you could really do a good scenario with any of those or cut them. It's very sandboxy in that way.
In that same vein, there's no way you can go through all of the manifestations in this scenario. There are so many that as a GM, I almost said as a keeper, it is so helpful to be able to just reference the map of where they are in the house and dive through a list. Again, I didn't follow the willpower recommendations, but it's pretty easy to see them as a grade from like minor to severe, and then picking what felt right for that moment. It's still an extremely helpful resource.
Well, it sounds like in general, you guys consider this a pretty strong scenario. I mean, Lexi said it was your favorite Delta Green scenario. I feel like just hearing you guys talk about it, I'm excited to try to run it with my own group at some point. But let's talk about the limitations, some of the stuff that maybe Keeper should be on the lookout for. You got me saying Keeper too, Lex.
The handler.
The handler. What should the handler be looking out for as far as limitations go?
Just as a note, it is PvP, so that can be a strength or a limitation, which is dependent on your group. But as for limitations, if you have players that really like don't engage with the house and they don't want to go into it, that can kind of be a hamper, and you'll have to find creative solutions. Because even though it can call and be like, "Hey, come to the house," the player can just be like, "No."
I feel like that's where being a Delta Green agent comes in, is like that's the stick.
Well, but that's also one of the struggles that I have had with this. The first time that I ran this, I ran it by the book as written. And as Nathan mentioned earlier, there's not really a timeline or any kind of pressure, as agents can kind of take as much time as they need with it. And there's a significant risk of that, Alex, where they're just saying, I don't want to go in the spooky house. It's bad in there. I'm like, okay, well, what are you going to do?
Play the game.
And so I have some thoughts to try to up that ante a little bit. But by far, the biggest, most commonly cited limitation for this scenario is that the most crucial clue in it, Isabel Wheeler's diary, is as written inside of an end table that you need to solve a puzzle for by a skill roll. Don't lock things behind skill rolls. That they need to contact Elizabeth Tucker in order to reach. There are multiple furniture items that they can track down, and an end table is not exactly the most significant one. And if players don't find that, they cannot progress with the scenario. The only option for them is just to try and burn it, and you get the rug pull ending. So I spent a lot of time trying to think of ways to address this, because this is an Achilles heel of a limitation with a scenario.
Right. The scenario itself states that the scenario only ends in one of two ways, which is the consecration or the elder sign BS with the loop around clue out of nowhere that relies on meta knowledge. So it's what you call a not a chokehold. It's a
bottleneck.
bottleneck, right? That's the word.
A linchpin. There's a linchpin to this whole scenario, and it's that diary and an end table.
Yep.
And it's locked behind both circuitous thinking and skill rolls, as written. Don't do this, please.
So before we get into reanimating the scenario, we like to contextualize our general experience histories with Music from a Darkened Room. I've only read it a couple of times and have wanted to run it, but only read it.
I've read it as well.
I've watched quite a few playthroughs of it, and I'm sure I read it for this.
Mm.
Reading comprehension's low, maybe. Come on.
And then, as I've mentioned, I have run this twice, the first time being by the book, and then the second time being a reanimated version that I'm going to spend way too much time going into that was much more successful.
Well, with that, let's get into reanimation. So overall, how do we highlight the beating heart of the scenario?
Get him in the house. Get him in the house. I mean, that's just it. If they spend 5 or 6 sessions not going in the house because they're so afraid, it's gonna drag on. Get them in the house.
It's definitely an exercise in pacing.
Mm-hmm.
That, and I think being able to lay out tantalizing clues and not make the house seem like an instant death trap. They need to realize that people have spent years living in here before ultimately biting it. And they're going to spend a lot of time going through the newspaper archives at the county seat, going through other sort of change in titles of ownership of the house. And to be able to piece together this sordid history that is stretching back over 100 years into all of the deaths and murders and accidents that have been plaguing this home and finding just a host of survivors. So ultimately, most of these are going to seem like accidents or suicides. And the agents will think, okay, well, I'm not going to bring any sharp objects. I'm not going to bring any weapons. And ultimately, they have to go into the house to see what's up. This is where it is truly on you as a GM to have the house be, in my opinion, be coy. The house is a giant, bitter cat that is wanting these little mice to come inside and is taunting them and is tempting them with little manifestations, shaving sand loss off here and there. Once you can actually obsess one of the agents, your job is going to be a lot easier because they're going to be continually drawn back to the house. But if you give them just very light, unnerving spooks, especially giving them some additional information with it, like Yamila Asari's diary and other things too, that will tempt them into spending more time there. Then you can bring out the big guns and have the house potentially start hurting them as it gets bored or as they start getting too close.
Yeah, Lex, I gotta ask, as the only person that's run the scenario among us, have you found that it's difficult to get players into the house? Because honestly, it's your job. You're Delta Green agents. Like, I could understand if this was Call of Cthulhu investigators, but like you are being told by the powers that be to figure this shit out. I'm struggling to understand how players can really drag their feet on that one.
Okay, so if I'm going to get into this, this is one of the first major restructures that I did for the scenario. So if we can, I would like to start back at the top. I changed the timelines around a little bit. I had Yamila Asari found dead on November 2nd of 2016. And then Donnelly's ex-wife called his office after he missed picking up his daughter for Thanksgiving, which was really unlike him. This was enough to set off a couple of warning bells for Delta Green, so they sent in some agents to investigate, found his phone in his apartment with a note that said 1206 Spooner Avenue. This is all extremely uncharacteristic of him, and it's been gone for months. So then agents are the first group that are sent in as, quote unquote, FBI agents with a, quote unquote, official statement designed to go in, investigate everything, and sweep it under the rug officially. They have this statement and can give it to the cops anytime, but they have a vested interest in finding out what the fuck Donnelly was doing there because he just fucked up big time, and he's a senior Delta Green agent. He knows better than this. So they need to investigate this in December I do December 10th or so. Yamila Isari's mother, who you can name whoever, I named her Noor Isari. Yamila bought the house with cash and owns it outright, which means that ownership of the house would have defaulted to her next of kin, to her parents, who I have as living outside of the United States. They are going to get hammered with taxes if the house remains in their possession at the end of the year. So I have the mother reaching out to local real estate agents, Amber Donovan, to try and sell the house as quick as possible before year's end. So she is leaning on Michael Buffington to wrap this shit up so I can put it in the market because I have to flip this house immediately.
So that's your time crunch. Then.
Exactly. So you have a time crunch from a few angles that the agents need to get in, find out what the fuck, because they're getting pressure from several angles to try and wrap this up, which was much more efficient than they can spin their wheels as long as they want.
That makes sense. I like that, actually.
Also, anytime that you run this, I highly recommend playing it with sound so that there is music coming from a darkened room of someone playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. So as they're approaching, increase the volume on Moonlight Sonata. Oh, yeah. But then as they're approaching and they open a door, then pause the music, it cuts out.
Start conditioning them like Pavlov.
Yeah. Exactly. Sound effects work great in this.
So moving forward with the reanimation, are there any plot points or NPCs or the flow of the scenario that we want to remove or improve?
So this is actually a question for Lex, because I know Lex tends to read a lot of haunted house, like horror literature.
You got me.
So I was wondering if you've taken inspiration from anything or added your own custom scares.
Yes, I absolutely did. Again, I'm going to highly recommend Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey. There's a lot of really good house-based horror, which is perfectly fitted to transpose in here. Actually, as a little bit of a spoiler for the book, I made Amanda Braintree's death one of the more creepy scenes that are in the book, where the main character wakes up drenched in sweat but is freezing cold. There's no blankets in the room, and there's this black mark on her stomach that she finds that the source of the coldness is under it, in it, and reaches into the hole in her stomach and feels the slick, cold snakes coiling inside of her and starts pulling, desperate to get this coldness out of her, and ends up yoinking her intestines out. I had that happen to Amanda Braintree in her child's closet and bedroom too, and she was officially labeled as a suicide. One of the weaknesses of the scenario is that you are given a long list of victims of the house that does have dates, and it is handy for that way. But it just says accident, suicide, murder, suicide, fire. And it's really up to the GM to, one, piece together the causes of death that are written in the scenario, and then put them in this table, and then two, fill in all of the other blanks. I'm happy to provide the list that I made for it because, yeah, there are some doozies that you can find in there that you can then link in with like dream scenes for agents where the house is still kind of influencing them in their sleep.
That's a good point, though, is this can be a bit of a longer run. And that's okay, because that does let you get that dream time, that time for players to maybe contact their bonds so that it's somewhat reasonable that the house may reply over what the bond might say, where the bond might be saying, oh, come home. But that's not what the agent hears. The agent hears, you should stay there for longer. Go look into the house. You can really mess with stuff that way.
Or if you're feeling particularly cruel, you can have the bonds call the agents in the house. The house can call the bonds back as the agent to say, hey, I want to really check out this place. Why don't you come over and visit?
I found a new home for us to buy.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and realistically, if they're talking about destroying the house, you can also just have the house start burning bridges. Ring, ring, honey, I think we should end things.
I've been cheating on you.
Honey, yeah, exactly. And depending on how much it knows, it could, drop some juicy secrets of, by the way, I killed a nosy police officer that was looking into this thing. The body's here.
Oh, no.
Yeah, Nathan, to your point back at Chaosium Con that you could have Mr. Corbett swat the investigators, the house can absolutely call in the police. As the coroner, the sheriff, they've spent lots of time in here, and I'm willing to bet that it has their numbers on speed dial. So if they're getting up to some shit, it can call the cops on them. And Michael Buffington doesn't tolerate funny business.
House is a Karen confirmed.
He does need to show up with a shotgun. No funny business. Bam, bam, bam.
I think one additional improvement I would add is to flesh out what would happen if the agents do burn down the house. Because one, you could treat it as, oh, we'll just end the game there. Or you could continue it. Let's say they're in the process of burning down the house. Well, the house is kind of a glutton and it needs to store up those power points. So might as well take as many agents as it can with it when the house is burning. Have it possess someone, have it shoot someone in the leg so they can't escape from the smoke inhalation. Like, have the nosy neighbors come in and try to put out the fire as described by Lex before. And if they even do manage to get away from the burning house, there's going to be an investigation. There's going to be the fire department looking into it as a case of arson. Have consequences, because once that house burns down, you'll have a little time to do home scenes. Have maybe a year or 2 or 3 or 5 pass while that house is being rebuilt. And when the agents learn, like, oh, the new owner just unalived themselves, that's a sand loss hit, because it's like, oh, we didn't do our job. And that house is back. Alternatively, I could see another ending where the agents just buy out the house to let it rot. Potentially that could end the game, or you can have that option of continuing the game because, let's say, people keep breaking in and then killing themselves, and then rinse and repeat just like that. That's how you can get them back into the meat and potatoes if you are dead set on lifting the consecration.
What do you think about making the house a little bit more manipulative if they're talking about these things, it trying to cut deals, trying to persuade the agents that actually I have a lot of information about magic, hypergeometry, other
just sign
agents.
your name in the book, right?
Exactly. Sign your name in the book. Keep me around. I promise I'll be good. I'm a good house. I'm a friendly house. Now, you've convinced me through Arthur Donnelly, who's right here. Look at him. And his ghost shows up, gives a big thumbs up, and says, I love this place. Not only is that really creepy, but I might see some agents taking it up on that. And then you've got a long-term thread you can pull on.
The house becomes a bond.
So on a similar note, the house can reach out as the voice, as the being of anyone who is trapped behind the mirrors. So at some points during my games, I have had Arthur Donnelly call the agents, and he's breathing heavily. It's, listen, she's somewhere else right now. I don't have much time. And then tries to give them something, then he cuts off. And then his voice gets a little straighter, and then gives some kind of negative information to bring them back into the house. That way they can learn that it seems like sometimes the people are genuine and sometimes they're not. And it's hard to read when that switch occurs.
Would you call for a human?
On a phone call?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be difficult.
Not really. It's someone they haven't met.
How would they differentiate between the house?
Kind of up to the players. They can decide if they want to be suspicious or not. Like, I leave a lot of these up to the players to decide.
Yeah, if you were desperate for a role, maybe an int test for them to think of the, like, you might not have paranoid players, especially if they're not used to this sort of setting. So they might go, oh, that's funny. Arthur just called me on the phone. He said we should go inside and just cut our own throats. Worth a try, right, guys? I'm exaggerating, but you might do an int test to say, hey, guys, you know the house, like, you've seen, if they've encountered it before, you've seen the house lie. This might be another lie, guys.
You could give them conflicting information, too. Have one phone call be like, stay away from the house. And another one saying, come to the house. If you really want to choreograph it.
I think that you could, but in your interest of getting people into the house to the meat and potatoes, as you mentioned, like, there's plenty of ways to fuck with them. And this is one that I'm constantly trying to use as fishing lures to get them back in. In this case with Donnelly, he could mention that there's something she keeps buried under the floorboards. One of the manifestations in the house is extremely unlikely. I actually had it happen in my run. I was shocked. But if the players pry up these hardwood floorboards, they can see that there's a crawl space under the house that is not accessible from the outside. There's lots of little animal bones and things under there that you can amp up the creepiness. And if they go crawling, there is something else under there with them that can attack them. This can be a big scare moment for them because all of a sudden the hole that they climb down is no longer there. To the people that are watching, it's just like a moment has passed, but the other person comes up screaming and bloodied. That can be a great realization that the house lies. And so you can have your scare, the house gets some sand, and then you can do an obsession or a possession if it wants.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of circling a little bit back to all of these endings we just hashed out, is it worth even entertaining the idea of the elder sign, like trying to insert it organically somewhere in the scenario? Or is this just like a throw that right out kind of option?
So I actually used the elder sign in my first game because the players were stuck. I had 3 sessions in a row of nonstop investigation and research trying to find some other way to end the house because they did not want to do a human sacrifice for the ritual, and they didn't think that burning it would work. Because of this, basically, they found some scans of pages from the Necronomicon that has the little leaf figure on it. They scratched it into some stuff and then started smashing the mirrors, which pissed Wheeler off. People were coming in with axes and it was trying to pull them into the mirror. So I still had a big explosive showdown at the end as they were trying to smash all 9 mirrors with this one stone. I don't recommend bringing this in. Something that you could conceivably do is have some kind of a cursed item within the green box that they could pick up that has an elder sign on it, but would have some kind of very bad effects associated with it. Maybe they can't put it down. Maybe it's a mask they're compelled to wear on their face. So you could give that as a significant cost to another avenue.
Mm-hmm.
As an alternative, I could very much see a cell or the program having this information, but it'd take a lot of convincing and a lot of evidence for them to use that and give that kind of information and knowledge away.
That's fair. And do you feel like, well, I guess you utilize this ending and it seemed like to decent effect, Lex, because I was going to say, does it kind of take away from the themes of like helplessness and like the inevitability and, you know, there's a sacrifice. This is just a hard decision made. Like, do you feel like giving the elder sign is kind of, I don't know, taking away from the true horror of the scenario, possibly?
It would remove that kind of horror, as you mentioned, this helplessness, this needing to commit some kind of dark ritual in the name of a greater good to try and cleanse the house without even knowing if it'll work. And so instead, they were getting tired because they were doing research, but were too much of scaredy cats to go into the house. So I instead made this a big explosive finale of the house using everything at its disposal. They knew that the house was dangerous and they knew that it was scary. They did not know how scary it was. It is causing them to vomit blood. It is reaching out from the mirrors to pull them in. It has taken Emiliero and possessed him with the axe they were going to use to kill a chicken instead of a person in the ritual, and he's coming after them. Almost cleaved one of my players straight in too. I think he rolled like 10 damage and they had 12 HP. So you can have a shit show as a finale if they start smashing the mirrors because the house knows this is actually vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Same thing whenever they are doing the ritual. I tend to roll it that if they come back, the house is still very much a welcome home. The doors are open. It's inviting them inside more. But then as they lay out the bowl or the dagger, and God forbid they start reciting things, all bets are off. And it is going pure Amityville horror on them. This is to the vomiting blood. This is something that I took from The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. Is a really great scene towards the end. Vomiting blood and seeing there's little hard specks of white in it that through their bleary eyes think that they might be teeth, but no one else can see any blood, that it's all still just an illusion that is racking them with pain. And this is where you can run into some issues. Isabel Wheeler is primarily limited behind mirrors. And if they happen to do the ritual in the den, in the main living area, there's actually not a lot of mirrors that are around in there. So I tried to tempt them into the master bedroom, which is like kill zone. But they stuck with their guns and did the ritual within the main den area. And so Isabel didn't have a lot of options to slash at them with the razor because she needs to be in a mirror to be able to hold it. What I would do in hindsight now is have the house turn on the faucets while they're doing the ritual. It's a weird thing. They're not going to think to go out of their way to turn the faucets back off. And that water is going to flood across the hardwood floors, providing a reflective surface that they can then see this negative Isabel Wheeler standing in the room with them, attacking them. There are other ghosts and things that can reach out from that. Another option, I had the razor blade clatter on the kitchen counter with blood dripping. You could do the same thing with that blood just spilling Sam Raimi style to create a reflective pool on the floor. That would be a great way to try and really up the stakes in that final conflict.
I like it. Just processing that. I like it.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, this is horrifying.
Yeah. And I think, Lex, it sounds like you handled this well. How did the players feel after that? Because you had a couple different endings, right? One where they had a big action bit, but mostly because they needed an elder sign to get out. And you had another where they did a ritual very smartly, actually, in the den without mirrors. I could see players liking that because they made some smart decisions and they were rewarded for it. How do you feel after all that?
So for the first group, I don't think that they were a great fit for this scenario because they were kind of wanting a little more action, a little more punchy. So they came away with some fun stories. My one regret with that group is that the player who later got hit with the axe first was pulled into the mirror.
Yeah.
And they had just one hand that was out reaching and one player was pulling them to try and get them out of the mirror. As the other said, he was in a red mist rage and smashed it with the Elder Sign rock. I didn't want to insta-kill them, but I desperately wanted to have the mirror shatter and just their hand falls back down as they are trapped on the other side. Next time. But to your main question, Nathan, for the ritual, I really juiced this up a lot because I feel like the ritual is very weakly written in this. It's just they do it, and the avatar of Nyarlathotep says, "Oh, you better not. You better not do it. Oh."
You better stop.
And then they say, "Go away," and he does. So this was the way that I really ran this. As I mentioned, once the house realizes that they are conducting the ritual, it will do everything in its power to stop the main casters. I had an agent who was already obsessed with this ritual. I can share some resources for the ritual that I created. One odd note is in the scenario, the Dark Man is written as L'Uomo Nero, which, if you Google translate it, could turn to the Boogeyman or the Black Man, which I wasn't crazy about. So I changed it to L'Uomo Oscuro, which is just dark. So anyways, they were doing this ritual to summon this avatar of L'Uomo Oscuro. The house is going crazy. And when it's complete, everything stops. It's quiet for seconds that stretch on like minutes until they hear a board creak. And at this point, all the shadows in the room are growing longer and almost congealing in the ceiling above them and dripping down into this form. So this is just a shade, kind of like a second thought of Nyarlathotep that got summoned. It's kind of like, you rang? All the players were unnerved at this moment, and they just had a thought in the forefront of their minds that was not their own that asked, "What do you want?" They tell it to leave, whatever. And Nyarlathotep, being a sneaky little bastard, asks for what in exchange. This caused the players to freak out because they just murdered a shitty trucker. That was their victim of choice, which I have war stories about that. But they just murdered a guy to summon him. And now it's asking for what in exchange to actually get it to leave. They didn't know about this cost, but they couldn't have. There actually is no cost. I kind of pull a Ghostbusters on them. And if they think of anything, the first thing that they reply with their minds, if they say that person, because I had two agents who hated each other because one of them tried to kill the other ones. So if Poe would have said Tracy, the shadows would have swarmed over Tracy and he would have disappeared, then showed up later as a new avatar of Nyarlathotep. Fortunately, these players just thought that's your sacrifice, that's your exchange, which is the best option. They don't have to give him anything, but it's just another trick to see if he can get something extra out of the agents while he's there.
You know, I was debating very heavily because Nyarlathotep isn't a lot of stuff. I mean, a lot of stuff. But this actually seems like a decent use for him. He, they worship, they put stuff to him. He's signing names for witches and stuff. It seems pretty appropriate. He's kind of tricky.
I agree. I kind of think of this as my exception to the rule that I'm exhausted of Nyarlathotep because it focuses much more on people fucking with black magic. And it focuses on this weird family that was doing rituals for the Dark Man in Italian, which isn't immediately apparent. And the players will keep looking things up for this. I actually stole some good bits from Wikipedia because players are going to want to look into the Divitellos. There is a thing in Italian folklore called, I'm probably going to butcher this, stregheria.
Nailed it.
Which are essentially Italian old witches. Long before the days of Salem and the Inquisitions, there's always been that kind of paganish witchcraft. And if they start searching for Italian folklore related to it, they're going to find this on Wikipedia, because I found it on Wikipedia. Except they find that these stregheria only follow males in families as some kind of a bloodline hereditary. So it's weird that Adele Di Vitello would be some kind of practitioner. They also have Umbria, which is a god of shadows and secrets that lives in the underworld, but it is always described as female. So for this to be L'Uomo Oscuro, they keep getting this misalignment of like, it's almost there, but it's not. It's weird. And then they finally get the realization that it's something else. So there's always that much of a barrier between Nyarlathotep that my players never realized it until very close to the end. And it felt fine. It didn't feel like just the Loki of the mythos.
Not the Mythos cinematic universe.
No.
So you talked about this before. The end table in the diary. That's a big problematic area to get to.
Right. We kind of jumped to the ending, so I'm going to spend some time on all the other shit that I changed for this.
Well, yeah, let's talk about the diary there, because I'm curious how you solved that.
So for that, I have a few potential options or ways that the diary can be found. The first one that actually happened in my most recent game is if the players pull open the floorboards to see in this crawl space, they can see something rectangular is poking out over a pile of what looks like maybe rubbish on the ground. And someone is going to have to squeeze into this crawl space and go over to it. So there's these brittle snapping bones of animals, and that skull's a little too round to belong to a cat or dog. And things get really fucky. They feel like they're crawling uphill over a mountain of bones to reach this diary. And then that's when they hear something else scatter behind them on the opposite side of the house. If they have a mirror, they can see there's two glowing red eyes, but only in the mirror, so they have to scramble to get out. It was a great chase scene. It was a ton of fun. But they got the diary. And so then from there, they could continue on. If they don't do this, my surefire method is, in the scenario, there's a manifestation called kicking a penny. If they go into the master bedroom, they accidentally kick a penny and they see it roll through the mirror and then land on the opposite side. It's a great little Sandloss moment to say, oh, what the fuck? But whenever they're in the master bedroom, they hear a loud thump from behind them, causes them to jump a little bit. They can turn around and see the bloated, waterlogged body of Anton is standing in a doorway in the reflection behind them. And he's pointing adamantly towards a book that is on the ground, reflected in the mirror only. He's nodding emphatically and trying to speak, but water is gurgling out of his mouth. And the agents need to reach into the mirror to pull the book out as a big sand shredding moment. And it's cold, it's mucusy on the other side, really icky, but they have the diary. Then Anton runs away as soon as that they actually have their hands on it and goes. If they're in the house for a while afterwards, they hear a child screaming and crying because Anton is getting his ass whooped by Isabel Wheeler for giving away her special secret. And now every time they see him afterwards, she is controlling him. They're going to see him as a friendly NPC, and that is now a trap for the future.
I imagine when they do open that book, it's all backwards because it's been in the mirror dimension.
That would be fun.
Nice.
Oh, I like
so
that.
They would have to recite it through a mirror, which also means they have to bring a mirror into the room to do the ritual when they're reading off of it.
Yeah, I love that.
I do. I like that a lot.
And so to give some additional hints for other things in the scenario, I made it that Arthur Donnelly was clearly living in this green box for months, and they don't want to open that 1 5-gallon bucket in the corner.
Ugh.
There are fast food wrappers and all these receipts and things. And in this stack of notes that they find for this antique furniture that he has in this storage unit for some reason, that he has been in contact with Elizabeth Tucker. And there are lots of receipts, and he's been funneling funds through the FBI to pay for her services to track down all of this furniture. But of course, since he's died, his bill is also unpaid. So agents need to find a way to pay her, and then she can tell them, oh, well, the table that you're looking for is in. The scenario says that she lives in Meadowbrook, which is weird. I set Meadowbrook in Indiana because it doesn't make sense for it to be in New Jersey. I have it as like idyllic suburbia, Hattonfield, Indiana, Illinois, doesn't fucking matter. But it's very much a sleepy town that players should feel a little safe in. And the residents have a dark secret, and they just don't like to talk about the house because it's not polite. So Elizabeth is in Chicago, hot rodding around, but she's very efficient for the program. I don't give the agents any contact information from the outset for Tucker or Yarrow. I let them discover that Donnelly was coordinating with Elizabeth Tucker, because otherwise they don't have a strong reason to contact her. Even if they know they have it in their phone on speed dial, they have never done it without significant prodding from my part as a GM.
That's really good. Yeah.
So from a mechanics point, do you actually keep track of the house's converted sanity to willpower?
I just have a sheet of paper that I make tally marks on, quite frankly, as it's pretty easy. Just whenever they lose sand, keep track, mark it down, and then erase a few lines after it spends it to do something. Because not every possession or obsession attempt is going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so something that I also love about the obsession part is you can ask them for a power roll and nothing immediate happens. And I'll just give them that handout later, which, of course, in nod to a certain book, I made every instance of the word house in red text instead of blue.
Yeah, I hate tracking numbers like that as we go, so I might make it like a once a day, or maybe after a big sand loss it recharges. But
I mean, honestly, yeah, you can just wing it. If you know your agents have lost some sand in there, then go for it. Like, I rarely ever had it do an outright possession because, in my opinion, it's a lot more fun to watch them squirm.
Yeah. It's a lot more fun to play a obsessed person too, where you don't have the GM saying, hey, do this. I mean, if you tell the person that it's like, the house wants you to kill, most of the time person's gonna start killing, even though it's like, it's just a suggestion. It's just a suggestion. Hey, I got a rocket launcher and it's going somewhere, man.
Absolutely. And this is where in my handouts that I will send to affected players, I just say, like, you will do anything to protect the house. And this is getting a little bit into war stories territory. But in my last game, the player who was obsessed with the house was dead quiet. He never did anything about it, never acted a little weird for it. And I kept reminding him that he was possessed through DMs. And he was like, oh, no, I know. And after the other agents got the diary and started looking it up and had this ritual and were making a plan to reach out to Emil Yarrow and know how to actually do this ritual with the dagger and bowl, that is whenever he went off like a sleeper agent. as he offered to drive them in his truck to go visit Emil Yarrow at Fulton College and took the interstate. And as he was going down off the access ramp, he mentioned it to me in a DM. So as he was going in the access ramp, he intentionally turned hard to get his truck T-boned with both of the other agents on the right side of the vehicle to try and kill or disable them to prevent them from affecting the house. This destroyed their trust with him and was fucking hilarious for me to watch as a GM. And actually led to a really interesting kind of lapse or a scene there, as I then gave all of the agents kind of a home scene. I described them in the hospital. They kind of fucked up immediately after talking with the police, and their handler comes by incognito and asks what the fuck happened. And they kind of go back to their lives. And these key incriminating items are missing from the actual police investigation. I give them a brief home scene for them to describe what they're doing. And then a few months later, I gave the obsessed agent a Valentine's card that was put in his mailbox in February 10th with no address or sender. And under "Will you be my Valentine?" in hard black marker, it said, "Finish what you started."
Ooh.
The handler then reached out to the other two agents who had not been compromised and told them they had free license to use any means necessary to stop this house as a vector, knowing that it required a human sacrifice. So I set them up as extremely opposing ends because the affected agent knew they were going to try and kill him. Even doing a bit of a closed table arrangement, he was like, "I'm not going in there alone with." So it made this really great return because they had to hire construction crews to fix the hole they tore in the house. And, well, wouldn't you know, there's a few accidents, like that nail gun just went right in his temple. It's such a shame.
Yikes.
And realizing that they had more debts on their head because the house had to be remodeled before it could be put on the market. And they show up whenever it's an open house on Valentine's Day, because don't you know, love is in the air. And so because of this, since they started as the first crew, they then became the second crew to wrap it up. I found that added a really nice follow-up to it.
I could see having a lot of fun too, is you could just let that home scene go to another scenario and then have the house reach out again. And it wouldn't even have to be necessarily a long bit for the agents that are left, but that might be a fun way to highlight that of like time passes and then you get that reminder like, no, it's not over. Doesn't work for a one shot, which is how we usually operate, but if you had a campaign, that could be fun.
I think that's recognized as the intent for, if they burn the house, have them do another opera and then they get news later that the house is back. I've just never had agent continuity for multiple operas like that.
Yeah.
So that was where I was happy to kind of bring it back in for the same run, as they were just older, sore, and more bitter.
And that was about a session or two after that kind of crash, because they didn't have to do the research, right? Is that about the time it took?
So over the home scene, that was where the one agent, Poe, got obsessed with the diary because she really wanted to conduct this ritual. The other agent, Groggy, actually used all of his vacation savings to buy the table from Elizabeth Tucker because he wasn't going to be able to relax anyways. So they were a dream team to conduct the ritual, and they needed a victim. And I mean, Agent Tracy got the other two almost killed, so there was no love lost from the agents or from the group. Because also in my mind, they know that the house can influence people, so why would they risk bringing in another group that could get contaminated? Right. They're going to bring this group in, and I just had their handler tell them, we're giving a second chance. We do not give third chances.
So let's talk about expanding the scenario. Do we have any ideas on where to take the scenario after the ending or expand it?
Have you guys heard about this campaign with Nyarlathotep in it? It's the tasks of somebody. I don't remember it exactly.
That's crazy.
They're going to go back in time?
Yeah. I mean, you technically could, but yeah, that I don't know if that would make it more lethal or less lethal to have it be Delta Green trying to investigate that.
It'd certainly be more violent.
Yeah. I mean, in seriousness, though, if you split it up in two, you could do something there. Nyarlathotep is in a lot of scenarios, so this could be a good introduction.
Well, actually, what I have in mind, and Beth, if you're listening to this, stop it. She rolled an +1 crit success on an occult roll to see if she found any other information about this L'Uomo Oscuro figure. And for that, I said her character was a reporter. And so I said, as part of a story for alt-right extremist Christian organizations within the US, she read this book, The Passover Angel by Reverend John Balfour, as a direct link into Ladybug, Fly Away Home.
That's good.
So my plan is to then have Poe return for that, to walk a new group of agents as a tryout into the program.
Great. Love that.
Also, I do want to mention, I'll be posting the handouts that I used in this most recent run. And also, I've commissioned friend of the podcast, Colin Richards, to do artwork of the front of 1206 Spooner Avenue. Because while there are several interesting art pieces in the scenario, there's nothing for the actual house. So this is my treat from my favorite scenario to other interested handlers.
Wow.
Nice.
Thank you.
And Colin.
So, Lex, I've got a kind of a bonus question for you.
Sure.
What was your favorite part about this scenario?
In the times that I've run it?
I know, I have a gun to your head. What do you enjoy most?
Pull the trigger.
I mean, the house might make me do it.
I love that it is the house doing things.
Okay.
It is not necessarily an entity in the house that's doing it. My favorite quote from my second game, after I had the house call the other players as the one agent who was obsessed, I just sent him a private message saying, I'm going to need you to call the others and get them back into the house. I just say like, hey, your phone's ringing. And without missing a beat, hey, yeah, I saw the real estate agents parked outside and I think she's trying to sneak in. I'm going to go in to try to stop her, but I think I may need some backup. And so the other two immediately catch an Uber with a stoner finance bro student at Fulton College who drives them up and see that there's no other cars on the street and that the front door is slightly ajar, but no lights are on inside. They get to the sidewalk and they're seeing like there's no cars, there's no nothing. And Tracy is not picking up his phone again. So one looks to the other and says, I think the house just catfished us.
Oof.
We hope our deranged utterings are helpful in bringing this game to life at your table. You can join the autopsy discussion on Discord and subscribe or follow the podcast to hear more gruesome cases. Be sure to check out the show notes for links on where to find the scenario, where to find us, and other links for things like handouts, actual plays of this scenario that we recommend, and other resources. So until next time, thanks for listening to RPG Reanimators.
Where your games can die and get trapped behind a mirror.
Or live.
On the table.
In the mirror.
In the mirror.
In the mirror.
In the mirror. I had to say it.
Sorry. Stregeria. Fuck me, I can't even.